Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I would also like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video input or audio from the audience. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Thomas, and I'm a Project and Research Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are here to discuss the contents of Linda Jaivin's new book, The Shortest History of China, available in bookshops and online at blackinkbooks.com.au. The discussion will look at China's past, its outlooks, and its ambitions, and what this all means for Australia. UTS ACRI's Adjunct Professor and UNSW Emeritus Professor of Chinese History, Louise Edwards, will moderate this in-conversation style discussion with Linda Jaivin. Audience questions are welcome at the end, so please remember to submit your questions using the Q&A tab along the bottom panel of this Zoom webinar. Now, a little bit about the speakers. Professor Louise Edwards is an adjunct professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute, University of Technology, Sydney. She is also Emeritus Professor of Chinese History at UNSW School of Humanities and Languages, and Honorary Professor at the University of Hong Kong School of Modern Language and Cultures, an elected Fellow of 3 learned academies, Academy of Humanities in Australia, the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and the Hong Kong Academy of Humanities. Professor Edwards served as President of the Asian Studies Association of Australia and is Editor-in-Chief of the association's Women in Asia book series. Linda Jaivin is an expert in Chinese politics, language, and culture. She has been a foreign correspondent in China and is co-editor of the China Story Yearbook, an associate of the Australian Centre on China in the World at the Australian National University. The author of 12 books, she writes regularly for the Saturday paper, The Monthly, and Australian Foreign Affairs. I will now hand it over to Professor Louise Edwards to begin the discussion.
Thanks very much, Tom. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to engage with Linda on this fascinating latest book that she's produced. As Tom said, ACRI is dedicated to exploring international relations. So we're not going to focus so much on China's history tonight, but in the way that China has engaged with the world historically, how it's influenced the world, and what it's likely to influence the world into the future based on this historical trajectory. Now, in The Shortest History of China, Linda's well-known audacity and daring do is on shine at its very best. She takes us from the Neolithic era, that's like 10,000 BCE, all the way up to the Xi Jinping era of 2021. And that's all done in 250 pages. Now, very few people would have the knowledge, let alone the courage, to tackle this project. And she's done it and produced a remarkable book that's not only informative, but it's hugely fun to read. And it's not at all an easy thing to write an accessible but authoritative book on such a vast sweep of history. So really, it's a testament to the skill and knowledge that Linda's got, that we've got this wonderful book here today. So what we want to do today is just explore what this longue durée of history in China means to Australia. What's the current situation that we're all living through is one where we're a nation that's really struggling to find a productive way to engage with China's return to global power. And so what I want to do is start my conversation with Linda from the very back of her book, and the last page of this book has this, makes the following statement: China has flourished most in times distinguished by their diversity and openness, such as the Tang dynasty. And what we think of as Chinese civilization is the product of myriad interactions and exchanges between the Han and the peoples and cultures of Central Asia, the far southwest, the northeast, and beyond. So, Linda, why did you want to conclude the 250 pages with that statement of cosmopolitanism?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you so much, Louise, for that very generous introduction. I'm not sure whether it's bravery or foolishness, really, to put that all that history. But I think having one of the things about writing the shortest history of China is that I was able to get a vision of the sweep of it, because I think a lot of the time we're looking at one particular aspect of China, or we're looking at the history of one particular thing. And looking at the sweep of it, what I saw was some of the greatest cultural periods, some of the greatest, periods of cultural efflorescence and Chinese power coincided with both openness to the outside world, connection with the outside world, and also an ability to absorb and assimilate both peoples and ideas from the outside world. So coming to this, my last chapter was devoted to the new era of Xi Jinping. And it is, what we're seeing now is China it's very, very forward in its ambitions for projecting power, whether that's soft power or its assertion to to the South China Sea, and its assertion of sovereignty over parts of the South China Sea and so on that are contested. It is at the same time not a very open time, and they are very much into assimilating other cultures, but that are already contained within China, so other ethnicities, but not in an open way. The new language is about an overall Chinese nationality that smooths out or erases or suppresses a more vibrant expression of different nationalities within China. So I think it's really interesting to compare China's policies towards the outside world now with some of the times of great cultural efflorescence and global power. I mean, the Tang was an amazing global power.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about some of those periods. So you've mentioned the Tang, but there's also the Yuan dynasty and some of those other periods, even not so stable periods like the May 4th at the start of the 20th century, and how they were manifesting this openness that you said leads to the greatness that China offers the world.
Well, I think the Tang is especially interesting because that was a dynasty where they were so confident in their own culture, and they were so confident in their, China was economically strong. I'm talking about before the Tang dynasty began to fall apart. Of course, I'm talking about its greatest period, but it did last for quite a long time. So people would come to the Tang, to Chang'an, the capital, from all over. People came from Europe, they came from Japan, from Korea, from Persia, from places all along Central Asia and beyond, from India and so on. And the Chinese of the Tang, or they would call themselves the people of the Tang rather than Chinese, because that's a later expression of nationality, they were really interested in ideas from overseas. So that's when Buddhism, for example, really flourished in China. And that was something that came from India. They also cooked with Indian spices. They experimented with Turkish clothing. They played Persian polo. All of these things were very interesting to the people of the Tang. And of course, they were such a vibrant, it was such a vibrant society. Also, a lot of musical instruments that we now consider Chinese instruments came from places along the Silk Road, and were incorporated into music in Tang China. But this was a time when other people really wanted to be like the Tang. So the kimono in Japan, the Korean dress, these are all developments out of Tang Dynasty fashions. Kyoto modeled itself after Chang'an. And this is a time when Chinese language, when the Chinese writing, which is not an easy kind of writing, but it was adopted by Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and other places as an ideal form for formal, for the writing of formal documents and so on. China had this enormous soft power, as we would now call it. So it was a two-way street. I think that was really interesting. When you talk about the yuan, that was a slightly different story because the Tang was genuine soft power. The Mongols exercised what we might call sharp power and hard power. You know, Genghis Khan thundering with his troops and raping and pillaging all the way to Europe is not exactly an expression of soft power, but it was certainly an extension of power. Now, we'd have to technically call that Mongolian power. But the Yuan dynasty in China, which was the part of the Mongol Empire that was China, that we consider China, was run by Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. And he was also under the influence of, I must say, his wife and his mother, who were two of his greatest political advisors. He was also quite open to what we might now call foreign influences. So the Yuan dynasty entertained papal envoys, and they were open to people converting to Nestorian Christianity. I believe his mother was a Nestorian Christian. They were very interested in having foreigners serve in the public service. Now, one of the reasons for that was that they didn't trust Han Chinese, because they knew that their conquest of China was so brutal and violent that the Han didn't trust them, so they didn't trust the Han.
Yeah, okay.
They brought in Persians and Turks and Tibetans, who were considered foreign at the time, to run things like tax collection.
So you're describing a situation where what we currently, or what most Australians would currently think of as China, is much more complicated. It's not the hermetically sealed, monocultural, 4,000 years of history with a single line of culture stretching back unchanged, or or just absorbing a few things but not really very interested in the rest of the world. What you're describing is a very interconnected society. But that then makes me think that ways of being Chinese, ways of conceiving of yourself as Chinese, must be fairly capable of change also, so that what people say, oh, I'm a Chinese person, that what they might say now is not going to be the same thing as what they said 200 years ago, and maybe not even 50 years ago. Because, if I'm watching Chinese soap operas now, like with youth soap operas and things, I'm seeing something that looks very much akin to the New York Girls TV show, that long-running series where there's all these youth living in New York trying to find their way. And I look at the Chinese soap operas and they seem very similar. So there seems to be more similarity to me between contemporary China and New York than there is between contemporary China and the Tang dynasty or the Yuan dynasty that you're describing. So, how is it that this idea of Chineseness can be so capacious, so in all-encompassing? What is it that holds this China thing together?
That's such an interesting question. And I think some of the answers lie in the fact that while Chinese history has had many, many different phases, and there have been enormous periods of time when China has actually been divided. It hasn't been one country at all. And there have been times when there have been civil wars or wars between many different states, all claiming to, be either independent or or wanting to conquer all the other states. So the thing that holds it all together in a way is, I think, is a sense of the literary culture, of the written word, of the fact that beginning in 3500 BCE, when we had the beginning of Chinese characters in what's called oracle bone script, there's a line from then through to the point in 221 BCE when Qin Shi Huang unifies, everybody in China talks about Qin Shi Huang unifying China, but in fact the China that he unified, I've got a map in the shortest history of China, didn't include Xinjiang, Tibet, the Northeast, the Southwest, and actually a big chunk of the Southeast as well. So it was a particular,
very small, but yeah,
it was a part of China that he unified. But one thing he did very significantly, besides unifying weights and measures and so on, was unifying the writing system, because it from its beginnings it had become very particular. It evolved differently in different places, and he put it all together and said, we're going to unify the characters. Now that meant that from that time until the present day, we've been able to have a single line, and a very, not a line, it's like a tree with many, many branches, a literary culture that is so rich, and that histories that were written in, around the time of, around say 100 BCE or so on, these are histories that are still in school texts today. So these contribute to a sense of a unified civilization and culture. And because you have this ability, I mean, Xi Jinping will quote from a Song dynasty poet when he's talking about the problems that China faces and the challenges of how to rule China. This is the thing that I believe holds it together. You can say history holds it together, but what is history? It is a written record. So it all comes down to language. But it's very interesting because even the story of language is complicated. There was Putonghua. We all talk about Putonghua, the national language, or sometimes it's called Mandarin. The reasons it's called Mandarin is that its first expression as a national language came up in the Qing dynasty, so relatively recently, when an emperor couldn't understand any of his courtiers. He couldn't understand his ministers. Everybody spoke a different dialect. And he said, let's get this together. And they created Mandarin, because officials are called mandarins, based on the Beijing dialect. And then it was in 1913, after the Republic of China was formed, when again this issue came up, and they thought, well, it's not just the officials who need a common language. If we want to have one country, we need everybody to be speaking one language. So they had this meeting, and I describe it in my book. It's quite interesting. They have a meeting where some people were arguing, well, Shanghainese should be the national language because we're this great entrepot. We are a really important place. Cantonese are saying, well, we connect really well with the outside world, which is an interesting argument, right? In this context of talking about China and the outside. And in the course of these heated discussions, a Shanghainese said something that a Beijing person interpreted as a curse word, and the Beijing person punched him in the face. And the Shanghainese fled. And anyway, they did decide that maybe this national language, this Putonghua, this common language, which is the literal translation of Putonghua, can be based on the Peking dialect. But even in 2014, the Ministry of Culture in China acknowledged that I think less than 10% of its population spoke Putonghua with native fluency. Yeah. And 30% spoke it hardly at all. So we are talking about a country which is composed of an enormous number of different cultures and different experiences. And to get to your point about the contemporary, like this could be in New York sort of culture, well, that happened also, as you were saying, and I forgot to answer, following the May 4th period, in the 1940s, places like Shanghai were enormously cosmopolitan. 30s and 40s Shanghai, I mean, despite all the craziness and the corruption and eventually, and the Japanese, invasion and all that, the 20s and 30s and 40s in Shanghai were such an open cosmopolitan period that in some ways, people from New York and Europe were coming to Shanghai for its cosmopolitanism. So
and at that point, you've also got the introduction of Marxism. We now know China is a communist giant, right? It's the one-party state that founds its philosophy, its economics, or some of its economics on the idea of, the philosophies of Karl Marx. Now, that's a European idea. And yet globally, there's no way you could talk about communism without talking about China or Maoism.
That's right. And I think this is where China has used its vast powers to assimilate and absorb and recreate, because it's such a powerful, because the length of its history gives its civilization such tenacity and, I suppose, a kind of a comprehensive power to take things in and not break, It can absorb things in. So Marxism and Leninism was absorbed in via Mao, and then later refined by Deng. And now Xi Jinping's seeking to put his stamp on it as well. So we have this tremendous transformational power of Chinese civilization. And as you say, you can't talk about communism today without talking about Chinese communism. And Chinese communism is very much a different thing from that which Marx or Lenin envisioned.
And the other thing that struck me about your book was the extent to which at every point you include the contribution of women to Chinese history. But there's also really interesting aspects where women's role in international relations comes to the fore and is, changing the shape of China. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about one particularly interesting one. In the Han Dynasty, they began a practice which continued all the way through the Qing, which was called heqin, or peace marriages, or princess diplomacy sometimes in English language texts. Now, this was basically the trafficking of lovely young princesses to often to tribes or other countries that the Chinese rulers of the time, or the Han rulers or whoever they were, considered barbarians. So it wasn't a really nice thing to do. They considered these less civilized people, but they would seek to tie them in alliance to their dynasty by marrying a member of the royal house, a young woman, to a chieftain or, a leader of these other places. Now, this was not, and they would also send lots of gifts of silk and tea and so on. Now, it wasn't really something that was experienced as very pleasant for a lot of the young women. I have a beautiful poem in the book, which I just want to read very briefly, written by one of these princesses. And she says, "In a place far, far away from my home, I was married to the king of Wusun. The sky is my house, felt tent my bedroom. So much I miss my early years in Chang'an. I wish I could fly back like a swan." Now, what's interesting too is that another woman who was married to the Wusun people took with her in her entourage a very intelligent young woman called Feng Liao. And Feng Liao herself ended up marrying a general of the Wusun. And then she was so smart that the Wusun, she was negotiating when the Wusun had conflicts among themselves. She was the one who was helping to solve their problems. She was also so respected that she was when there was a conflict and the Xiongnu, or the Han, were threatening China. If the Wusun had allied with the Han, or the Xiongnu, Han isn't a correct word that's used now, but the Xiongnu, if they had gone with the Xiongnu, that would have been presented some danger to the Han dynasty. But she persuaded the Wusun to ally themselves with the Han instead. Now, the Han emperor recognized her talent and made her an official envoy of the Han, and she was the first woman diplomat, therefore, in Chinese history.
Well before Wu Yi. Okay. Because I guess we've talked a bit about, China's religious capacity to absorb all sorts of religions, make them Chinese, whether that be Buddhism, Islam, even Christianity. But we've got also, and we've talked about China's connections with many different changing borderland regions. But there are points where China says enough is enough, and whatever China is at that point, where they actually do, attack, expand, as well as defend and retreat, and sometimes be taken over by foreign powers, like the Manchu dynasty, the Manchu Qing you were talking about with language. I mean, that was a foreigner trying to learn Mandarin, right, or trying to create Mandarin because he was having trouble with his Chinese. So,
which was his second language.
Which was his second language. So, China's ebbed and flowed over many years, but are there some key points that we would say are China's core interests today that have some connection back through history that, what should Australians be aware of in terms of how China's leaders see the world now, and how much of it is connected back into that longer term historical path? What are their core interests? What do we need to take seriously as China returns to this more confident role?
So China's core interests, as defined by the Communist Party of China, are one thing, right? And these core interests have expanded over time. Now, the whole business with the South China Sea is very interesting because they now define that as a core interest. Whereas a number of years before, say in the Deng era, there was always this issue of contested islands and so on, whether they were the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands of the northeast, which are contested with Japan, and or there's parts of China where they have arguments with India. They have arguments with Russia. These are all historical problems left over from history. There's also the South China Sea Islands and so on. They have become far more assertive lately, far more clear in calling them core interests. Now, Xinjiang is Xinjiang and Tibet are very interesting because Xinjiang was conquered by a Qing dynasty emperor in the 18th century. It was so resistant to that conquering that it had to be conquered again in the 19th century. Tibet has a really complicated story, but Tibet used to be a major threat to Chinese dynasties. It attacked the Tang and sacked its capital and so on. It certainly wasn't part of China then. So a lot of Chinese foreign policy has always been about managing these areas, conquering them, somehow assimilating them. Xinjiang kind of went slightly AWOL during the Republican period because the Kuomintang rulers didn't really have a good grasp on it. The northern half broke off and declared itself the Eastern Turkestan Republic, supported at the time by the Soviet Union, which then helped get it back into Chinese control once the communists came into power in 1949. All of these histories are very complicated. And it's interesting that when China says Xinjiang and Tibet have always been part of China, they're actually they're not making this up entirely on their own, because just to give us a small example, the Qing dynasty, when it conquered Xinjiang, said also, well, Xinjiang's always been a part of China. What they were talking about were Han and Tang dynasty garrisons that were established along the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road ran through what we now call Xinjiang. And for those of you who don't speak Chinese, Xinjiang, the name Xinjiang means new borderlands. So it's new frontiers. So it's obviously not the old place, it's the new frontier, right? But there used to be tribes and so on living across there, and these routes for trade that are called the Silk Roads or the Tea Roads that ran through there were prey to. There was lots of banditry, and there was lots of, people. I mean, there's really great things going along that road. There's beautiful silks, and there's teas, and there's all the other stuff. So of course there were bandits. So the Han and some of this trade was in the nature of official trade. It was tribute, which is a whole nother story. We'll leave that for the moment. But it was an official kind of trade. So they sent out soldiers to establish garrisons along the Silk Road. That is the claim. Now, they didn't establish countries. They didn't rule the area. They ruled the garrison area, but they protected it and guarded it. And those are the basis of the claims that China has always, ruled Xinjiang.
So that tells us that it's contested space, and that there's histories of losing it, regaining it,
exactly,
backwards and forwards. So
and the Chinese Communist Party today talks about something, and they're very, very serious about this, historical nihilism. There's even a hotline for it. If you want to dub Louise or me in for historical nihilism, you can look it up. But
we'll put the number in the chat.
But the thing about historical nihilism, and they are very serious about this, I think they've deleted something like 2 million posts from the Chinese internet so far, is that it is, what it is if you tell the story of China differently from the way the Communist Party tells it. That's the most simple explanation. The Communist Party of China has its official history, the history of the PRC, which of course necessarily connects back into Chinese history. If you question that history, this is now historical nihilism. It is not allowed. And why is this a serious thing for China? Why has it become this thing where you have to have a hotline and everything else? Whereas not so long in the past, in the Deng era and so on, there was quite a lot of vibrant historiography going on in China itself, looking at Chinese history and talking about things like China's relationship with the outside world and so on. It's relatively recently that this is, it's Xi Jinping. They've always been sensitive about how certain stories are told, absolutely. But, and Chinese patriotic education began shortly after the whole Tiananmen student protests and so on. Patriotic education is telling Chinese story in a certain way to make China to emphasize the grievances, legitimate grievances against Western imperial powers and so on, but to make that pretty much the whole story. Now, what I was going to say about historical nihilism, why is Xi Jinping suddenly gone very hardcore on this? It's because he sees historical nihilism as being one of the causes of the downfall of the Soviet Union.
Okay, so it's about national integrity. So this is core interest. So then let's tackle the very tricky topic of Taiwan then, because this has come up in the Australian media a lot recently. So from Xi Jinping's China, what's the historical antecedents to the core interests in Taiwan?
Well, okay, so the story of Taiwan is that until the 17th century, there were indigenous people living there, and they were later called Shandiren, which implied mountain people. But in fact, they lived everywhere until they were actually chased into the mountains, pushed into the mountains by settlers. But until the 17th century, they were really just kind of fishermen. They might have come from Okinawa, Japan, China. Some people were blown off course when they were escaping Genghis Khan's hordes back in the Yuan dynasty, and they were escaping up the coast in boats, and they were blown off course and ended up there. So you had these little populations on Taiwan. But things get interesting when the Ming dynasty fell to the Qing in 1644. Now, as Louise, you mentioned, the Qing was considered a foreign dynasty. It was Manchu people. They were not Han Chinese. They had their own homelands in the Northeast. They had a different culture. They had very cleverly assimilated a lot of aspects of Chinese culture and learned about it and how to govern and so on. But the Qing, when they conquered the Ming in 1644, a lot of Ming loyalists who were like Han loyalists, who were like, this is a foreign dynasty, we have to fight against them. They fought very hard in the south against the Manchus. A lot of them were slaughtered. There were terrible slaughters at the time. But there was one guy called Zheng Chenggong, and he's known as Koxinga in English because it's a kind of a bastardization of a title given to him by a pretender to the Ming throne. Which is a kind of a noble title. Anyway, he led the resistance, and in the end, when it seemed futile, he took his followers and they went to Taiwan. And the idea was to make Taiwan a kind of a fortress where they could then retake the mainland for the Ming dynasty.
Sounds very similar.
It does, exactly. So because he had done this. Now he died soon after, and obviously the project wasn't going to work. And so the people who had gone to Taiwan settled there, began farming and fishing and mixing with the local people and so on, and pushing the indigenous people up the mountains. Anyway, it was in the Qing dynasty after this, later in the 17th century, that the Qing decided they had to exert formal control over Taiwan. So they sent some officials there. Now, the officials, it was a fairly loose thing. It was kind of like, you know, raising the flag and you have some people there. So it was officially under Qing control. Now, it stayed under Qing control until 1895, which is when China lost a war against Japan. A very shocking loss, because Japan, little Japan, who are they compared to us? You know, they got their language from us and their clothes and everything else. And suddenly they were a modern power, and they had defeated China in a battle, in a war. And so one of the things that Japan got was Taiwan. So they occupied Taiwan. Now, Taiwan was then under Japanese occupation for 50 years until 1945. Then it was handed back to China when Japan surrendered in World War II. It was handed back to China, which was run by the nationalists, by Chiang Kai-shek, who was too busy fighting the communists and being corrupt and all that stuff to really worry about what he did. He just sent some people to Taiwan. He sent some, kind of similar to the Qing, you know, hey, you go manage that place, okay? They were very happy in the beginning because they'd been under colonial occupation from the Japanese. They welcomed the nationalist government over there, but the nationalist officers who were sent there quickly proved themselves incredibly cruel, incredibly corrupt. And I won't go into the whole history of it, but there was, they pushed the people to the point of absolute outright rebellion against them. They were cruel, they were violent, and there was a huge uprising, and they crushed it with even more violence. So this is when you have this sense of Taiwanese identity beginning of the people. And the Taiwanese are people who had been there for generations, as opposed to the mainlanders, who were those who had just come over from the nationalists. Now, all this got a lot more complicated in 1949, when, just like Zheng Chenggong in the Ming at the end of the Ming dynasty, Chiang Kai-shek took his troops and followers, and they all landed on Taiwan, which they wanted to make an island fortress and a base for retaking the mainland. And we all know how that ended up.
So now we've got a situation where, from Xi Jinping's point of view, retaking Taiwan is part of the sort of tidying up of history, an unfinished historical process.
So it's kind of like the Qing going, we really have to take this place, and they kind of did. And then what you have is Xi Jinping going, we really have to take this place. But it's much more complicated now, because there is such a strong sense of local identity, really, really strong. And even the remnant, the KMT, which still survives as a political party and has been soundly defeated in landslide electoral victories for the Democratic Party, which has the thing you cannot ever say, which is independence leanings, right? But they definitely don't want reunification. The Kuomintang is losing strength and power, and even a lot of its members know that they don't want to talk about reunification anymore because it's electoral, suicide. Yeah. So you have a very difficult situation for Xi Jinping, who realizes that as time goes on, Taiwan's people will only become more and more resistant to the idea of unification.
Okay, I have heaps of more questions, but Amy has just sent me a message saying that we've got to move to open up to the floor and take some questions from the audience, because all of you know Linda and I could talk for hours and hours and hours. So I've got a question here from Keen Wong. Many thanks to Linda to stress how history is written, is a written record in the official Chinese imagination, and to remind us that Mandarin was a modern decision. To the lament of us cosmopolitan heterodox Cantonese. Okay, so Keen, I'm with you on that one. Can it be that Xi Jinping's rewriting of China's history, is what upsets the West most, suggesting the way out of vexing times might be doing contested history debates instead? Okay.
So, thank you very much for that. By the way, but I do love Cantonese. So is contested history a way out of what could you repeat that little bit?
It's like, can it be that Xi Jinping's rewriting of China's history is what upsets the West most? So it's the telling of the story that is challenging. So China now is presenting itself confidently. It's no longer saying, oh, we're so weak, we're so sick man of Asia, we're so useless, come and pillage us. They're basically saying, no more pillaging, we're returning to the stage. And it's the telling of that story that is causing affront to Australians who aren't used to Chinese people telling the story proudly.
Interesting. I would say that most in the West have no sense at all of the rewriting of history in China. So I would say that people in the West mostly rely on the headlines and what's going on. And in fact, what we should do is look back to the Deng era, when China's rise was welcomed, when people were incredibly excited about it. They thought from all the rhetoric, the official rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party at the time was about opening up. It was about connecting with the rest of the world. It was about cooperation and exchange. It was about being a responsible, and China wanted to join at the time all the various trade agreements and the World Bank and all of this stuff. So the whole the West, broadly speaking, I mean, whatever that means, for most of the 80s, until Tiananmen kind of made everybody go, what's really going on here? Mm-hmm. Have we read this wrong? People were so enthusiastic and so positive about China. In Australia, incredibly so. It was an absolute golden time of exchange and very bright stories about China. I think what's going on now is not an understanding of the rewriting of history. I don't think that's actually the big issue. I think the big issue is displays of what looks like aggression or contempt towards what the West considers to be the rules of the game. Now, I think probably everybody here is very well aware that the West, that America in particular, wrote those rules. and so there isn't necessarily an element of inherent fairness in the rules, that they were written for the advantage of the US and its allies. At the same time, it is shocking to people who are used to that system to say, okay, now China wants to rewrite them. And some of the stuff that China is doing is definitely on the aggressive side. I mean, when it's, ramming fishing boats in the South China Sea that belong to other people, when it's challenging, when it's roaring over Taiwan, and doing a lot of roaring over the Taiwan Straits. with a lot of quite pointed and aggressive military maneuvers and so on. I mean, this is what I think is getting people upset, not the history. I mean, I would be delighted if we could all solve this by talking about history.
Yeah, and you know, we should certainly make sure history is part of the conversation.
Yeah.
I've got two questions here. One from James Lawrenson, and one from Helen Diacono. And James is writing, Linda, thanks. You've shown how China has changed so much over time. Do you worry now that we see Xi Jinping's China as the end of history, when actually we should leave open the possibility of change in the future, and perhaps not even in the distant future, maybe in 5 to 10 years? And then I'll give you Helen's question as well, so you can run them together if you want, or do them simultaneously, consecutively. Do you think there is a risk that China could invade Australia? So
Okay, I'll take the second one first.
Okay.
I would say that's extremely unlikely. I don't think we have to worry about China invading Australia. I don't think that's on the, I think if we decide to get into some big war, if we start talking about drums of war and all that stuff, we're inviting trouble. And I don't know what form the trouble will take, but it could take pretty bad form. Okay. So I think we really have to just shut up. I mean, I think the China hawks have just got to pull back that rhetoric, because they're playing to a home audience. They're not being smart, and you don't provoke a giant like China unnecessarily. But with those qualifications aside, I don't think China has any interest or plan to invade Australia. I think we can relax a little about that, except it was very interesting when Minister Wang Xining, I think his name is, he made some weird reference at the press club thing to something with zombies invading Australia and eating the people. And I was like, what? And then that kind of just passed, and I didn't have it recorded, so nobody mentioned it. But I don't think we have to worry about zombies, and I don't think we really have to worry about any kind of imminent invasion, but we do have to watch our language, because we have to be careful about what we wish for. As far as James, thank you so much for your question too. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't put time frames on this, but Xi Jinping, the Xi Jinping era, I think it's not going to last forever. Nothing lasts forever. What lasts is there is that continuum. There is something that continues. But I think the thing with Xi Jinping, it's very, very hard to tell how long this is going to be the norm, because you have several important, I would say the two most important factors. One is the level of incredibly successful propaganda and education in China to orient people to his way of thinking and looking at the world. The other one is surveillance and control over so that any opposing or even questioning ideas they just vanish, like my hair when I turn against the background. So I think that we have they're very strong factors in saying that his regime may be stable. We have no idea what's going on within the party, if there is actually, as Cai Xin, the person from the party school who recently, she's gone into exile in the States. I think she said that 70% of the party is unhappy with Xi. Is she right? Is she not right? Who knows? We don't know. And even if they were unhappy, what could they do about it, given the level of surveillance and control? And his latest purge, which he's announced, of disloyal, it's this campaign for all people in the security organs and so on, and police, to weed out any kind of disloyal thinking. There's a lot of control there. I don't think we're going to see a fast change, but who knows?
Watch that space. We've got one more question I think we've got time for. I've got two here. Okay, so I'll give you these two as well. Oh no, one's disappeared. Okay, from Wavinia Kong. Are there similarities between Chinese cultural diplomacy seen in the Tang Dynasty and contemporary cultural diplomacy? So hence, what are the future implications, if any, for Australian-Chinese cultural diplomacy dilemma? You know, again, it's asking for that. How does history inform the present in terms of cultural diplomacy? Because obviously the Tang were really good at it. Everybody wanted to be a Tang person, and, you know, from outside the world, and Tang people were quite happy to absorb stuff from outside. Very confident.
I think there's a couple of things. One is that the Tang was a two-way street, and therefore it validated other people's cultures as well. And I don't think that's going on right now. I think the Chinese have very much, they've embedded into the BRI the whole notion of people-to-people diplomacy. They're very attentive to the idea of soft power. But if you actually look at the Global Soft Power 30, which you can find online, and it tracks year by year changes, China's soft power has been decreasing because you can buy it to some extent. And so China's investment in whether it's exhibitions or whether it's building goodwill culturally in parts of Africa and so on, the problem is that China's soft power is a victim of its hard power and sharp power and its power projections. And when people are very uncomfortable with it, its soft power is less effective.
And that reminds me, in the book, you've got this great line where during the Cultural Revolution, it used to be said that China has friends all over the world, and now it has clients all over the world. And clients and friends, you know, that clients can be resentful if they don't feel they're being respected while they're being exchanged with. And I think that's, you know, goes both ways, doesn't it? The respect question.
It really does. And at the same time, I really encourage anybody who speaks Chinese, who can understand Chinese, to really get into the cultural products that are coming out of China, the books and the podcasts, to get a sense that's beyond the headlines, that's beyond all the political talk, that's beyond all the, you know, international relations, investigations and so on. Like, listen to something called 故事 FM. 故事 FM, Story FM, and you hear these ordinary people tell their stories. And I was just thinking about that because the other day I was listening to one where these women who had fallen in love with Africans were telling their story.
Okay.
And they were telling their stories, falling in love with them in Guangzhou, and then in some cases following them to Africa, and this sort of thing. And you can see this openness on the part of and that's not the only podcast that deals with international affairs, as it were.
And literal affairs,
literal affairs and other kinds. But you can see among young people, a tremendous openness to other cultures that you wouldn't think the Chinese, given that kind of projected sense of cultural, you know, superiority, might be open to. But there's a tremendous openness there as well among people. So it's a very complicated issue, but I think China is not doing as well as the Tang.
Okay, I have a question up there, and I've been told to wrap up. So one quick question to squeeze in
answer,
from Christina Ho, and she's saying, thanks for the alternative, the link to the Chinese sources, but what are the suggestion of Chinese sources, but are there any sources for people who don't speak Chinese, English sources, they're more diverse things that will get us beyond these headlines?
Yes, absolutely. Look at things like the oh my God, I'm trying to think of the translation blog. There's translation blogs that translate this stuff. There used to be, and I think there's still an archive called the China Channel that was run by the Los Angeles Review of Books. And there's often translations of Chinese literature and so on in there. If you Google translation, Chinese literature, translation, Chinese things, then you'll find stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great note to end on.
Listen to Chinese voices as well as official Chinese voices.
Yeah, get it more, because it's a big country with a lot of different voices in there. So yesterday when Linda and I were talking, I asked her if it was fun to write, and I wanted to wrap up with that, but she told me it was. So now I want to just show you the book. That's the cover. Oops, I've got to get it just there so you can see the cover. Do go and buy it. It's available at Black Ink and all other good bookshops. And also as a heads up for those of you who like Black Ink books, there's another book coming out on June 1st, David Brophy's China Panic, Australia's Alternative to Paranoia and Pandering. So that could be a fun read as well. But finally, before I throw back to Thomas, congratulations on the book. I really do admire your audacity and the daring do to take on not just the short history of China, but the shortest history of China. And I highly recommend it to everyone who's listening. It's a really good read, and you won't regret it, because it's just so much fun and really authoritative as well. So I'll hand it back to Thomas now.
Thank you so much, Louise. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, Louise and Linda, for such a fascinating discussion. Members of our audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it, and we can make sure that future UTS ACRI events are a better experience for everyone. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Also, Linda's book can be found in bookstores, as mentioned before, and online at blackinkbooks.com.au. I will show the cover in just a moment. So the discussion today is also going to be available on our website and eventually on YouTube as well. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers, Louise Edwards and Linda Jaivin, and thank you all to our attendees. We'll see you next time, and please, you can check out her book cover here now. It's a beautiful cover. Thank you, everybody.